with Jane Curtis this morning about the long and harsh history of the land of Syria. So welcome, Jane.
Good morning, Yvonne. I hope it's a nice morning for you that we can get into this somewhat thorny subject.
Yes.
We're not going to say much about, or anything at all, hardly, about Syria today, because that's another story.
Right.
But Syria has a very long and a very unsettled history, looked at it in the long run. One article I read about this said, since before 2000 BC, and long before, since before 2000 BC, Syria has been an integral part of, or actually the seat of government for powerful empires. The struggle among various indigenous groups, as well as invading foreigners. And this has resulted in, various different things.
That whole area has been tribal since day one. Depending how you define tribal, but it certainly had been different, a lot of different groups in there. Could we see picture number 1, please, which is a map? And this is going to be fun for you to see. This is a satellite view of the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And you can see the island of Cyprus pointing up there. And the east coast, this is known as the Levant, from the French left us that word for it, where the sun rises from their perspective. And as you look at that coastline, about halfway up is where Syria begins, and then it goes across. But we're going to look at a couple of other pictures here too that will show you a little more detail of what's down there. But down below you can see the tip of the Red Sea as it comes up, and you can then see the Gulf of Suez. The Suez Canal is faintly indicated there. To the left of it, you see the Nile Delta. So here you see this little area, the Levant, is in between the continent of Africa, or Egypt, which was once a great empire in doing things, and Turkey above, which again has an interesting history of its own. But if we look at the next picture, this is another satellite view, and this is taken a little closer, and you can see where the earth movements there's a split right up there. You see the Dead Sea. We once did a show on surveying the Dead Sea by the U.S. Navy. It was quite interesting. But Syria begins just kind of about halfway up there, and it does no longer have all the coast, because Lebanon comes in there. At one time, in fact, it was occupied. But then Syria starts up to the north and the west there and runs across. Now you've already seen with a big power on each side, which has often been the case. Syria is in the middle. It's a bridge or a crossroad or whatever, but it's an area of a great deal of cross action and cross fertilization. There have been some good cultural effects from it, but also some problems. Everybody wanting to get their hands on it. Think of Flanders in World War I, for instance. Except that here, instead of being the same people all the time, or the Civil War, for example, it's the same people coming and going through it, contesting for it. But in this case, it was most of the time other people. Oh.
So it was not such a homogeneous thing that came from it. I would love to see some of the DNA for the people in that area. Yeah. It must be fascinating. But if we look now at the next picture, we will see a map of the area again, and this is more of a relief map. It's a little bit, I wish the yellow were darker, because there's a lot of desert in there. But there's the Mediterranean for you, and then you can see the lines, the black lines, the present day divisions. So Syria has the area of coast on the top there, and then Lebanon comes down, and Israel. And Syria has borders with Turkey up on the north, and with Iraq over on the south, and with Jordan. So it's right in the middle of things. And pretty well always has been. And one more picture now. And this shows you in the region where it is. And you can very clearly see civilizations, the Aegean civilization there, people were coming over. And from the Mesopotamia, from that side, from the eastern side, people were moving over. They were on the move all the time. And Iraq and there's two big rivers. The Euphrates is actually rises in Turkey, and it comes down through a part of Syria, which is nice.
Well, Syria does not have a very long coastline, does it?
No, it doesn't. The coastline there, of course, was at one time. Now, we'll perhaps proceed a little more to our, 10,000 BC is 10 or 12,000 is the earliest they really have attested evidence of people living there. Rather typical back there, hunter-gatherers, and then moving on.
Right.
It's a good grain-growing area, a lot of it, that area. But Syria, in 2000 BC, had, or no, wait, is that right? Yeah, no, it's 20,000. There's already evidence of things going on back there. Then as it moves forward, the state, it's called a city-state, emerges called Ebla, and these are really the glory days of Syria. I don't know when they first started calling it Syria. I have no idea. I've tried to find that out. By Roman days, the Romans called the province Syria. I don't know if it had a different name, but this city-state name, it was called Ebla, and it was very advanced. It developed all kinds of commercial relations.
Oh.
So it was rich. It was in the middle there. It was dealing with all these things on either side, and it lasted for a rather considerable period of time. And I would like to show a few things just indicating what a high civilization that was. Let's please look at another picture. This, at one stage of it, now it came a little bit later, but this was the stage, and I'm sorry, for some reason that picture cut off, but you see it goes way into Spain, all over North Africa, and on the east it went clear over to where Russia begins, clear over to the Caspian Sea.
Oh, really?
And the Caucasian. And this was, at the time, it also looks like a map of the Muslim spreading Islam. But it was at that time that they really began to spread, in the middle of the 600s, when after Muhammad, right away, not long after Muhammad was born. But another picture now will show us a tablet, and this was typical, like a sheet of paper or writing something for us. And if you look closely, you can see that it's in cuneiform, which was the trade language of the day. The Egyptians used it, the Hittites used it when they came along a little later. And this country, obviously, then was a sophisticated trading partner, a commercial, lots of savvy. And we move on a little bit, we'll see an example of their next picture. We can see an example of some of the beautiful, fine work they did. And you've probably seen pictures of the lovely grills they had instead of a screen, they might have a beautiful grill thing, but they did very fine work in addition. This smacks a little more of the East. So the civilization there really partook in the Mesopotamian from the farther east, and then the end of the Mediterranean there. So it's quite interesting, the background. And how much of this carries over into present day people? I think people still debate about that. Scientists do. Is there such a thing as a group memory or the group reaction or whatever? But there's so many different ones. I imagine there are a lot of different ones which can explain some of the problems within this small country. So I think one more picture will do it now for oh no, I have a couple more. These are the ruins of this main city of Ebla, and they were extensive ruins indicating palaces, government buildings, all kinds of things in it. And the next picture shows you another close-up view. That looks as though it might have been restored a little bit, plastered up a little bit. But all of this now has gone by the board in the difficulties in Syria. What wasn't deliberately destroyed, oftentimes I think just fell by the wayside. If you're shelling what lies beyond that, that entryway,
it would be fragile enough to.
It's just gone. And so much was learned from archaeology about other places and other times. But we see at any rate that Syria had a very high heyday. And things began to, just these layers of different development began to happen. That civilization is sometimes, it's divided into 2 or 3 different periods. The first one came to an end about 2300 BC, when the city was burned.
Oh.
And you think of other places, that was a popular way of destroying a city in the old days. You think of Schliemann and Troy, you know, that kind of thing. But it was not occupied, apparently, because they rebuilt. It came back. And this went on for another couple hundred years, and then it was overrun again and became a vassal state. And this one state becoming a vassal of another, I guess this was toward the beginning of this whole phenomenon, which just remained. The whole area became, including the whole Levant, became divided up into these smaller kingdoms and tribes that were sometimes allied, sometimes not. And each of the big powers, most of the time there was a big power surrounding them. And they would then try for a sphere of influence over it and fight. And Egypt and the Hittites fought a couple of wars over the question, both of which were draw, really. So at one time and another, there's one big power. It's as though today Turkey had a complete influence over and controlled those states at the end, or Egypt did. And of course their glory days are long gone too.
Right.
But in between, however, Turkey did. But as we see, they became vassals, and this lasted for quite some time. The Hittite Empire arose. The Hittites, as I was just saying, jockeyed with the Egyptians for control over it, but never had it completely. And then came a group of people who were still sort of mysterious. They were called the Hyksos. And they were the not the CP, the Hyksos, and they came from the east somewhere. So they were some kind of Mediterranean, some kind of Sumerian, Akkadian tribes from the land of the 2 rivers. They did occupy it, and they hung on to it. But the Hittite Empire arose, and also in Egypt, they arose against the Hyksos after a couple of hundred years, got rid of them. But meanwhile, they had been sitting, square on top of what has become Syria. And and these things, the time lapse makes you think, well, is this really influence, or could it really influence a population or not? I think it could.
Oh, for 200 years, I would think.
Well, 200 years, along came the Romans. Or no, the Greeks came first, because the Greeks, Alexander's empire expanded.
Oh, okay.
And that included down there. And the Persians, meanwhile, had been in there for 100 years or so. The Persians were over what's now Israel too, Israel and Syria. They had the whole thing. So the Persians were on there. Then the Greeks, the Macedonian Greeks, came along with their influence. And what happened after the Greeks? Well, the Romans appeared after the Greeks. They took over Egypt, but all these people very wisely left the system intact in Egypt, the priesthood and so on, so they could maintain their stays. I don't know whether they did that in what became Syria or not. Syria worshipped many gods, nature gods and other powerful gods. But in the fullness of time, then the Roman Empire was, 2 empires. You also had the Eastern Empire. And then the Western Empire pretty well fell apart. And the Eastern one was not a nice overlord in Syria. And the Crusaders came along meanwhile, and they kept nipping away. Remember the Kingdom of Jerusalem? And they were fighting tooth and nail, and they didn't make it either. Of course, they were not the home team.
Right.
And that had a very pronounced effect on it. So you had the Romans struck out. The Byzantines were in there for quite a long time, the Byzantine Empire. And then they were pretty well overlain by the Mongol Empire. Famous date 1453, the Byzantine Empire was ended by the Eastern folks. The Mongol Empire came along. They were in the 1200s, 1300s, and they sat right on it, took Damascus and so on. A lot of these things come from old documents that were read. And why they pick out here, you took Damascus or you burned Antioch or whatever, it's because that's what's available to us in the old stuff, much of which is there. But by now we're up into the 1500s, and what comes upon the scene but the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire lasted then until the World War I, the end of World War I was done away with. And Syria had somewhere along in the 1919 or 20, right after World War I, when of course it was heavily occupied for strategic reasons by the Allies. But they had a brief period where they were technically speaking independent. But before anything could really happen, the United Nations got in there, and in settling the after effects of World War I, they declared a mandate over Syria. And this mandate was just a thinly disguised, just taking over. That's over the whole Levant. The French got the north part, Syria. And some of that reflects in their literature. There are a lot of things that are placed there. The southern part was given to the British, in Palestine, and that's how Iraq got where it got. So there we were in the after World War II period, and they think maybe, because they'd had some uprisings, maybe now we're going to make it. Well, the French didn't actually get out. They did have some dealings, and they said, we will get out and you will be independent. World War II came along, and again, everybody occupied a lot of operations in Syria, and the French didn't actually leave until 1946. And there were a few years where it was more or less independent nature, but you don't know how to be independent, I think, after that long, really. Right. And I don't know, I haven't seen any evidence. They looked back to these glorious years and said, we must get back to this, where we were with it and we profited by this hinge relationship instead of just being chewed up. But it didn't seem to happen that way, because at the end of the 30s then, you had Syria as a technically independent nation, but a few years later, who came along but Bashar Assad, and father of the present ruler. And he ruled with an iron hand. It was dictatorship again. You might say, well, these people, if there's anything to the DNA, or the group memory or whatever, they should have been used to that, having a strong hand on top.
Right.
And not...
Sounds like that's what they would be looking for.
It almost sounds as though that's what they'd be looking for. East Germany, for instance, sort of went to pieces when the West Germany took over and the communists left. Right. You're used to that, and when it's gone, what happens? Well, what happened, of course, was that he ruled with an iron hand, and he died in 2000, and the present ruler came onto the scene. And we don't need to say a lot more about what has happened since then. But you see, this whole past is a history of changes of overlord power over it, and at the same time, many little groups inside. Mm-hmm. And I think that goes back to that period when the Egypt-Hittite rivalry period, mm-hmm. where the land is not terribly chopped up. And on a place like Greece, for instance, many mountains, many valleys, it wasn't surprising that it developed into many little, even dialects of language from that. But it doesn't seem to have happened that way. They had fertile sections, and then a lot of it's desert. If we could look at that map again, I think it's number 3. I think it's a green one. And you can see how much of the country, you see it now has it developed this little channel up here, and there's the Turkish border. But you see a lot of it is green, but a lot of it is faintly or less faintly yellow. Mm-hmm. And that down there where it fades into Iraq, it's desert all over the place that you can't really do much with. as I mentioned, they occupied Syria, Lebanon for a time back in history. But Lebanon is famous for its famous cedar trees and other economic products. And Syria was also, had some of that, partook of some of that. And they traded, that was one of the things they traded with Egypt, for instance, because Egypt had no wood. It still doesn't have any really wood-growing trees of any stature. But you can see that they were open also. They were very much open, especially on the right, to things coming through. They were less open on the top, but of course the Hittites came down and around, and you had that nice little extension of water there that you could use. They also did trade with Cyprus and across the water there. So they added that to their talents, that they knew how to navigate and could do that. The effect of all of that on other nations around them was varied, because sometimes they were vassals of one or another. The only time I think when the weather ever changed, there was a brief period where the climate was a little more friendly to them. But other than that, in fact, it's surprising, because you think of things changing in a few thousand years, you know, in 3, 4, 5,000 years. But of course, the North African desert hasn't changed much either.
Right.
In that period, that's still a desert with things in it. But how much effect that would have, I don't know. And how much effect, the area of Syria, if you compare it to the area of Virginia, Virginia is about 42,000 square miles. I looked this up. Syria is about 71,000, so it's not even twice the size of Virginia. But the population, I found figures for 2012, the population was 20-some million. Virginia population was 8-some million at the time.
So very densely populated.
Densely populated, although a lot of the country is not good for much. Of course, commerce comes into the picture there, and the occupation of the country by, say, by the Mongols did a lot for communications. The Mongol Empire was great on internal communications, and they sat on it. That might have been controlling it to this day or much longer, except that the great Khan died. They were in the middle of Europe. They had expanded 6,000 miles. They had gone, in fact, they tried to invade China or Japan a couple of times later on, and it didn't work. But this was still, nonetheless, in its background, this Mongol system. And the Russians, when you look at it today now, let us look at map number, I think it's 4 that we want to see at this point. Yes, you can see that here there's the Caspian Sea in the middle, and on the other side of that you have Kazakhstan and those Central Asian republics of Russia. And you see, of course, Iran shows in large form there. And it's not too distorted, but Russia, it's nothing more really than going across the Caspian Sea. They're right there. And Russia has always craved its exits to the big water, to the oceans. Catherine the Great got them down to the Black Sea. And of course, the Caspian Sea is not much for commerce, but even if you go up above the Black Sea there, the Russians have very ready access. And in the Crimean War, the south coast there where you see Turkey fortified that, and Turkey was, as it were, protecting the rest of the Levant, which was being protected primarily, I guess, for its usefulness. But the Russians still could even if they wanted to by land, they could go across the Black Sea and through Turkey and be right there. So its role in the geopolitical.
We're fairly close. It's kind of hard for us to understand that in geography over there.
Well, it is until you look at a map. It suddenly really strikes you how easily it is and what a threat it is, in fact, if the wrong person takes over.
Sure.
Now, of course, the Crimean War, all Europeans got mixed up in that as well. And Turkey was known as the poor man of Europe at that time. It was in very bad shape and was easily pushed over. But the north coast of Turkey, it's interesting, was never, the Mongols didn't do much with that, and the Hittites, for some reason, didn't. They were clear over to the Aegean, but they left that alone. So I guess that shows you that it's more of a pawn. Of course, there's great economic interest in it. I want to look once more at the second map, the satellite map that shows us from above. This one now, this shows you a narrow strip. Now, the rest of Syria is not on there, but you can see its keen interest in what happens in Israel, which is not directly involved in a lot of its activities. And a lot of the land there is not really good for a lot. But when they fought, when the Hittites were pretty well taken over there, that was their sphere of influence when they get down there and fight. It gave them a definite foot on the ground, and of course it gave you access to the coasts. And that was something that they would need. The long and troubled history is I mean, you can see that it's one that.
So now, how long has Syria been under the influence of the Assads?
Well, since the beginning of this century. Well, since before the beginning. I think it was 1970-something that Bashir, that the father, took over. And that was no mean trick either, because the country was divided up into different units and different political parties. And in fact, I have some statistics here on.
We're down to 1 minute, so.
The 74% of them are Sunni Muslims, and this, of course, you see how
That's where the problem
whom
is
they
right
would
now.
want to hook up with and why. Another 12%, including the Assad family, are Alawites, which is an offshoot of it. And that's a curiosity in itself. You had caliphates, the number of people in Syria who actually went over to that, and Iraq. You had caliphates long back there in some of the early takeovers. There was the Umayyad Caliphate was a famous one that lasted for many centuries, and that's the one under which they expanded all over everywhere. So the ISIS, the Daesh people have gone way back to that in history, to pick that, and how successful it was. But unfortunately, under that caliphate and some of the others, and in Spain, the Muslims were not, it was not the crushing heel. They allowed other religions to persist. I think one of their criteria was that it be a single God. They didn't want any multi-deity things. But the single God, and they had to pay taxes. They pay large taxes. But they left them pretty well alone. And in fact, there was this great flourishing in Spain of culture, because you had Jewish and the Christian and this Muslim all working together. A lesson that nobody was able to learn. But they also now, they're about 10% Christian, mostly Orthodox. That got them into some stews too. But now 3% are Druze. That's a tiny clique. There was Gnosticism. There were Yazidis. There were people from there's Caspians from that region between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, and that they persisted. Then they even looked different. So you had this tremendous melting pot. But that's part of the trouble today. I think that they are different. But another part of the trouble might be that they're used to having a hand on top and don't know quite how to get it off.
We're going to have to end.
Oh, I'm sorry. We could.
But I think, as citizens of the United States, we really need to learn from this, because we are a very young country compared to any of these others. And I think we need to look at their history and see where we're going.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Jane.